I'm here with Michelle Bumatay, who is a professor of African Francophone literature and visual culture at Florida State University. And I am so excited to be here talking with you, Michelle. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, so Michelle, first, tell me how you got into this thing, comic studies.
Right. We all have when we go to conferences, we all kind of geek out about this and we all tell this story. So I've told this multiple times. So in junior high, I was with my family and we were just perusing a bookstore. Both my parents read a lot. And so I grew up in a culture of reading a lot. So we went to a bookstore and they let me pick whatever I wanted to pick. And I stumbled upon the trade paperback of Enigma by Peter Mulligan and Duncan Fegredo. And it's Vertigo, and it was put together. I think it was 8 issues originally, and it was put together in a trade paperback. And I picked it myself, and I read it, and I was hooked. And I had a lot of friends who were already reading comics too, but that one in particular really was something that kind of changed what I thought comics could be. And so from there, I was already kind of indoctrinated into British comics. So then from there, I went and I read a lot of Alan Moore stuff. And then I went and I read Frank Miller's stuff. So I started with kind of some of the heavy hitters, and then I went back and I started reading American comics as well. So I read comics all throughout junior high and high school, and I played a lot of video games. I watched a lot of anime. So I was already into fan culture, but when I was doing it, the internet was new, and it wasn't as pervasive in terms of mainstream culture as it is now. So I just did it in my free time. But then it was when I went to undergrad at UC San Diego that I started to major in French. And I took a course, an upper level course, and it was all on bande dessinée. And I had no idea that this existed. Translation has played a big role in this. That's just the fact that so many French ones hadn't been translated. And I fell in love. And so I was floored that someone could do research on this, and I applied to graduate school knowing that I wanted to work on bande dessinée, and I got accepted somewhere. It was quite a while ago now, but to have faculty that were willing to accept my project and say go forth was pretty incredible.
And that was UCLA, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So the UC is kind of taking the lead, heading the charge here with bande dessinée and the scholarly study. And then so did you write your PhD then in the space of Francophone literature and visual culture?
Right. So when I first got to UCLA, I thought I was going to work on comics in the 1960s and 70s. I actually did a summer research project on Mobius and the birth of heavy metal. And I was really interested in that. I was kind of interested in the May 68 version, but in the bande dessinée world. But my first year at UCLA, I was actually more drawn to postcolonial theory and postcolonial studies. And so the questions that I wanted to ask in my research weren't reflected in the kind of text that I was looking at. And so I didn't even know that African comics existed. And I stumbled upon it my first year, and I was so shocked to find how much was out there, and I knew almost nothing, and no one was writing about it. So that's what my project became.
Yeah, I love it. And so important. And kind of a nice segue to my next question about, really things you've already touched on a little bit, translation, gatekeeping, but comics we know is a planetary phenomena. And yet you yourself didn't even realize that, there's a great rich tradition of comics in Africa. The history of comics leaves this out. The scholarship's leaving it out. African comics, histories of African comics, and of course the Black experience and subjectivities generally.
Mm-hmm. Right. So when I started working on this, the question then, when people would ask me, what is your research on, or what are you researching? And I would say African comics, and they had no idea what I meant. And then this stream of questions came out, and it's my whole entire project right now since then has been to answer that stream of questions. What is this? And kind of figuring out the history of it, who reads it, what is the legacy there, where does it come from, who's producing them, like I said, who's reading them, and then what are they doing? What are the stories that they're telling? And very quickly, so as a graduate student, I tried to do a digital humanities project to go with this. I wanted to try and use Omeka to map out what some websites are already doing right now, where it's interactive map where you can click on different countries and see the cartoonists from that country. But very quickly, I found out that it's transnational. It's not linked to one country. And that's part of the story, is that it is center periphery for a long time because of the Franco-Belgian tradition of bande dessinée. That's what was inherited and exported to the colonies, the colonies and then former colonies. And then the networks of cartoonists on the continent are very, not Pan-African, but definitely transnational. So it's very hard to delineate national comics histories, even though that can be done. It's actually much more complex from the get-go.
Really fascinating. I was wondering about that. You know, how do we at once kind of respect regional sort of, variations, the different, so to speak, soils growing different kinds of stories, but then at the same time, like you just mentioned, the way that bande dessinée kind of blanketed as a part of a kind of maybe colonial armature or prosthetic, then being reclaimed, or even more so used as a kind of tool to, tell those stories that hadn't been told, and the transnationalism of that. Yeah. Wow. I don't know. My brain's already like going crazy with this. Michelle, tell me, while we're on that topic, why is it that, Francophone African comics aren't on the comic studies radar?
Right. So while I've been working on this for as long as I have, there's a huge gaping hole in Anglo American comic studies about this, because a lot of it's not translated. And then within European version of comic studies, it's not looked at as well because it's postcolonial studies to an extent. There hasn't really been an engagement with this until the last 10 years. 2010 was a huge shifting point for kind of Black bande dessinée, if you will. And I think part of what's difficult is that to categorize it as just African ghettoizes it in the same way that authors from these regions have been dealing with this for a long time. And so there's actually a lot of correlation between writers from former colonies and cartoonists from former colonies. And so the cartoonists, what's happening with cartoonists is happening kind of a generation later, or 1 or 2 decades later. And so they've learned some of the lessons that the writers from these places kind of had to go through. And there's more of a kind of pessimism that goes with it. But there's this huge lacuna in both versions of comic studies where no one's looking at this, and I'm trying to do all of this work. There are a very few handful of people, and I must say that Christophe Cassiau-Haurie in France, without his exceptional work at documenting all of this, the legwork, the interviews that he's done in French, without his work, I wouldn't be able to do a lot of what I do. Alain Brezeau as well has been instrumental for this. And then Sandra Federici, her recent book is great for this. But a lot of what ends up happening is they tell the story of this comic production, but they don't necessarily engage with the analysis of it in the way that opens up how these cartoonists are engaging with global questions of Black identity in the world, and have been doing it for a long time, actually. But the main reason for the lacuna here is that they haven't been translated, and it has to do with gatekeepers. So Aya, for example, by Marguerite Avoué and Clément Pahé, is the only one that still continues to show up on top 10 lists of African comics you need to read. And the series ended 10 years ago. It's already over a decade old. I mean, yes, we have the Kisi spinoff, but it's because she was published by Gallimard. This is actually one of the chapters in my book. That's not the main reason why she was successful, but because it was translated so early, it dominates the discourse about what are African Francophone comics. And it's not reflective at all of the diversity of what's been happening since the 1980s and earlier.
Wow, I cannot wait for your book, Michelle. But speaking of writers and kind of Black intellectuals and the kind of interconnections, I know you've you've spent some time in this other space, an earlier period, and then connecting it with bande dessinée and negritude. So maybe could you tease out for our readers and our listeners and our viewers what this is?
Yeah, so one of the main uses of bande dessinée by African cartoonists is to tell their own history, right? So there are a lot of comics that are about local traditions, local heroes, and so definitely Black intellectuals who were foundational for changing the discourse in the 20th century. So someone like Césaire. There was also an anthology to celebrate the birth of Senghor in Senegal. It's called Senghor 100 ans, and it's an anthology that comes from Burkina Faso. There's also lots of comic books not lots, but there are definitely comic books about Papa Wemba, the musician in Congo-Kinshasa. So there's this desire to celebrate cultures and legacies. So you have that on the one hand. The other thing that I see, because one of the things that I'm interested in as well, is the imperial iconography inherited from something like Tintin in the Congo, because that dominates. And Franco-Belgian bande dessinée were exported to the colonies, and people grew up reading them and identified with the main characters. And actually, Frantz Fanon talks about this in Black Skin, White Masks, where he says, it's not useful for someone in the Martinique, a young person in Martinique, to be reading Tarzan comics and identifying with Tarzan and internalizing the negative stereotypes about Africans. And yet that's what generations of cartoonists, artists, and writers grew up with, and they identify with the main European characters. So then what do you do with this visual discourse that's already encoded with racism, that's already encoded with essentialism? Especially with Hergé's Ligne Claire, right? That there's a readability to reality, and there's a easy way to represent reality is predicated on the use of stereotypes. So I'm interested in, what do cartoonists do? How do they engage with this visual discourse? Do they adopt it? Do they do something different? What are their influences? And a lot of them are self-taught by drawing based on European bande dessinée. So there's this tension. And I think in the same way that negritude was a defense and illustration of African and Caribbean writers, that's why they start with poetry in negritude, is the epitome of being able to write in the French literature. It's the most difficult way to do it. I think the correlation in bande dessinée has been realism. So the Kinshasa school of bande dessinée, under the tutelage of Barley Bahuti, for example, is very highly realistic. There's so much detail put into this. There's so much that celebrates Black identity, and it's a defense and illustration to an extent, right?
Wow. Michelle, I wish Florida State and OSU were like side by side so I could take classes with you. I'm just right now, you're expanding my brain in these incredible ways. How do they challenge, or how does someone like Jean-Philippe Stassen challenge and resist in something like Deogratias?
Right. So this was part of my project too. My book, the book that I'm working on now, is called, the title is Black Bande Dessinée, because it doesn't make sense to call it African, because someone like Jean-Philippe Stassen, where do you place him? He's from Belgium. He's a Belgian cartoonist, but there are other cartoonists of European descent who are working on the continent in Africa. And where do we place them? So identity, again, continental identity, national identity, where do we place them? But Stassen has been committed to representing different people or different issues in Africa for a long time. And he didn't consider himself a cartoonist to begin with. And it wasn't really until he traveled a lot in Africa before he started making bande dessinée, but it wasn't until he kind of did a series of portraits where he manipulated the clear line aesthetic and started to do something different and change it. And he has this very dense visual quality to his work, and it's so moody, but it's so beautiful at the same time. And so you see the transition in, there's a bande dessinée that he did called Thérèse, and you see it's the in-between. It's the in-between he was doing Ligne Claire before, and then Thérèse is the transition, and then Deogratias is the after part of that. And his work, it tries to look at the complexity of what is the post-colony and individuals who are in that world, and individuals from all kinds of places. But in particular, he has centered on Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide, and tries to engage outside readers for the most part, right? So his texts are primarily for readers in Europe. And it's fascinating. I've written about this, but it's fascinating that he started with Deogratias in 2000. And he wanted the readers to identify with the main character. And spoiler alert, the main character is a perpetrator, but you don't know that at the beginning. But Stassen made a conscious decision to not include a bunch of paratextual information that explained that this is Rwanda. So you don't even, it could be taking place anywhere. Yes, there are references linguistically to Rwanda, but there's only one small map very far into the bande dessinée, and it's completely decontextualized because that's how the West experienced what was going on in 1994. And the response text actually is Pawa. I don't know if you've read it, but it's so dense and it has so many different forms of representation. There's a play in there, there are linguistic notes, there are short bande dessinée. It's so dense, and there's an extensive bibliography at the end, and it's almost the response piece to something like Deogratias. Because he was a little bit upset with the response to Deogratias. Some people were using it as kind of an apology for what perpetrators had done, and was the response saying, no, it is much more complex than that, and it was kind of righting that error.
Oh boy, yeah, I'm going to have to go back to all of these. Can you walk us through a couple of panels from Deogratias?
Yeah, a couple of other people have written about this too, and they're really good. People pick up on it quite quickly that the open frames, right? The open frames are the past, and then the closed frames are the present, and then there are markers of the present. So you see Deogratias' t-shirt that's marked, riddled with holes, and then the exterior of the church where he was is also riddled with holes as well. So there's a lot of parallels that happen throughout the text, and the timeline jumps back and forth. And so I really see Deogratias as trying to walk through trauma. It is walking readers through what it is to be traumatized. And so what happens is you have the correlation between sites as locations, sites, and Deogratias' site, what he can actually see. So in the very, the way that Kathy Caruth says that you're haunted by an image, the entire text is haunted by an image. Deogratias is haunted. We see him being haunted. And so it's kind of like a post-haunting, a post-memory for the reader. But then we don't what has been the entire time until very close to the end. So Stassen purposefully delays this information throughout the entire text. And when we see it, there are these slim frames surrounded by lots of everything else. And they're glimpses, because that's how Deogratias is being haunted by it.
Yeah, post-haunting of trauma. Yeah, and how, Stassen is able to kind of bring that to us without the kind of sensationalism and, yeah, really extraordinary. What about, there's this other stuff, right? The Les Visiteurs, and then you also, I think you've done work on, how the polyvalent comic reportage can work to humanize but not essentialize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. In my chapter on this particular journalistic piece, I find it fascinating what he does with the surface of the page, and it really is this palimpsestic notion of history. And he's talking about the contemporary issues of immigration from the African continent to the European continent, but he, throughout the entire text, draws our attention to these multiple layers of history. And so there's at one point where he meets a migrant trying to get from West Africa to Europe, to the Schengen area, and he draws a map of the border between Spain and France, and he tracks the immigrants' trajectory, and at the same time tracks Walter Benjamin's flight from France during World War II, trying to get into Spain. And putting those two legacies together, right? So linking World War II and the Holocaust and colonialism with the current migration. I think he does that very successfully on the page. I think the page becomes this multi-layered place where multiple, it's multimodal for sure, but multiple levels of representation are constantly being called attention to. So yeah, on the first page, he shows a map of the Mediterranean, but it's turned 90 degrees to the left, and it's completely disorienting. He forces us to reconcile what our preconceived notions are, but the production of knowledge. He's continually interested in the production of knowledge and how that influences everyday, regular people's interactions. He really. So I'm working on an article right now called The Human Cartography, or Stassen's Human Cartography, because he's becomes more and more interested with maps. But what maps, what kinds of information is encoded in maps, and how that impacts our lived experience, or how we view others, and then how we should be treated and should be treating others.
So powerful. Yeah, landscapes, built spaces, maps, but as kind of visioned through the post-colonial subjects experience that can never kind of shrug off or be kind of sort of abstract the past, right? The past, the colonization, coloniality that we kind of carry with us. Yeah, I love that. Amazing. And you do work on other creators. And is it Pahé? Is that how you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can speak a little bit about humor and misrecognition. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love Pahé's work. He's so tongue-in-cheek at every turn. And actually, I've been reading Rebecca Wanzo's new book, The Content of Our Caricature, and a lot of what she's looking at in the American context applies to a lot of these cartoonists. But the cartoonists whose formation is in political cartoons, they all use this. And so you have different groups of cartoonists, some who come from a kind of political cartooning background, and that's their main identity. And then you have others who are traditionally trained in arts and go to art school. And more recently, we have graphic designers, and that's kind of the next version. But Pahé is very much invested in political cartoons and very much invested in Gabon and his country and telling his country's story. So he started off as a political cartoonist, and was put in jail for a sketch that he did at just a bar. Some police officers were there, and he was drawing a sketch, and he was thrown in jail because of it. So what is it like to be a political cartoonist when there's censorship as well? But so his work always plays on caricature, and sometimes he'll play up negative stereotypes for humor. In some of his blog posts, for example, there was a festival or a salon in Paris in 2010 that was celebrating African comic books. And he was there, and there was a roundtable, a discussion about should we censor Tintin in the Congo? This is when there was people in Belgium that were trying to get it censored. And there were, in England, it had already been removed from the children's literature section. So this is cancel culture before we're calling it that. This was already happening with Tintin in the Congo. And Pahé, I went to the roundtable, and Pahé cheekily said, when the interviewer asked him in French, he said, should we ban Tintin in the Congo? And Pahé's response was, in the Congo, yes, but not in Gabon. So he riffs on the title, and it's a joke, but it's still part of the heritage, right? So and it's interesting, when he drew that comic on his blog, he draws himself in complete black, and then with big red lips on purpose. And the interviewer is just a white character. But then at other times when Pahé draws himself, he's not that dark. So Pahé traffics in stereotypes on purpose to draw attention to that. And actually, in his autobiography, on the first page of La Vie de Pahé, when there's a European editor that proposes he write his story, his life story in bande dessinée, Pahé he performs broken French, which is they call it le français tirailleur, petit nègre, which is the deformed version of French, the language that was taught to soldiers prior to World War I, and it's this subservient. Kind of like massa, if you will. There's some term used like that. So he's performing this identity, and he plays with that all the time. And he sometimes you're not sure if he's being serious or not. And so his critique, his satire allows him more leeway than if it was just a political cartoon, for example.
So great. That we have some really wonderful parallels or analogs here with Lalo Alcaraz, with the Latinx, right, comic cartoonist using the same form. And of course, they all, I'm sure, just as, Pahé has, there are those who don't get it and, call them out and do all sorts of things. But I love it. I think humor is a really powerful way to kind of dismantle, bring down the guard, and then maybe do some work on readers, viewers that might not otherwise happen.
Can I go back just a second?
Yeah.
The other thing too, the thing that I love about Pahé, and especially visually, the density of his work, it's so messy. Even the frames that he draws by hand, it's got this super messy quality to it. And I love teaching it with Michelle Mbembe's on the Postcolonial, because there is this notion of excess, of cacophony, and of the grotesque at work here. And when you read Mbembe's description of the Postcolonial, you see it in Pahé's work. It's on the page for display. It's almost like a visual representation of Mbembe's work. Yeah,
beautiful. With Stassen, I'll keep going back to Stassen, but you've also done some work on post-colonial revisions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Stassen was changed by what happened in Rwanda on such a deep level. And he was really interested. He wants to know why. And at one point he thought about retranslating Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness himself. He was going to come up with a new French translation of it. But what ended up happening instead is he came out with an illustrated version of it. And so he adds illustrations to the text. So it's the original text just in French. He adds illustrations, and then there's some essays at the end. But what I find interesting, and if you read it as a comic book, if you read it within his whole work, I'm interested in the dialogue between the images and the text then, and what are the texts doing, their placement within the book itself. And they're always on the left-hand page, so they're always pulling you back. And there's always usually something in the bottom left-hand corner that draws your eye back there. But fascinatingly, the image that you chose, which is a wonderful image, is Africa. It's the map of Africa, but you don't know it. But a couple pages before this image here on the right, there is a map of Africa. So when the main character ends up going to Belgium, you see the map behind him, because he talks about the yellow space on the map that was blank, right? That's the Heart of Darkness, that's Congo. But here we have the main character in the foreground, but what's static is African suffering, right? There's a little bit of discomfort on the part of the European to be in Africa, but there's so much more suffering, and it's behind us, right? It's in the background, and it's perpetually happening. And so here you have the heart of Africa is represented by all of the men falling, and they're all chained together too. So it's the fall of all of them, essentially. And it's such a powerful image, in my opinion, that it's so static and yet so dynamic at the same time.
Wow, yeah, and it completely, if the experience of reading the original words, and then we have that, as you mentioned, to the left, completely, it takes, us into a whole other space.
Right. So there's one image, for example, when you kind of, it's just a boat on the river. So you're caught up in what's happening in the narrative as Joseph Conrad wrote it. But in the bottom left-hand corner, you see severed hands. And that's the legacy of the plantations, right? That under Leopold, in order to harvest as much as they could, sometimes the colonial officers would cut off people's hands, and there are photographs of this. There are postcards of these mountains of dismembered bodies, right? It's horrible. And it's not explicit, and yet Stassen's drawing our attention to that. He's saying that here are the hidden things, here's the underside of this.
Amazing. Michelle, how you teach a number of different courses on education, identity, and Francophone Africa, Francophone women cartoonists. Can you share a little bit of maybe some of what you do in those classroom spaces? Maybe the Michelle Bumatay trademark teaching method for bringing BD into the classroom space?
Yeah, so it depends on the course. Like, what are my goals for the course kind of guide how I'm going to introduce them into the course. But usually if I'm involving them in a course that looks at sub-Saharan Africa in general, I do not start with the image. I delay the image as much as I can because I want students to engage with the narratives. So I almost always start with a text that is written in the first person with the je in French, and anybody can relate to that. And so they don't have an image necessarily in their head of who the narrator is or what they look like. And so reader identification is very easy. And then we talk about the themes that come up. And then when we get to films or bande dessinée, they already are aware of these themes, but then we start to see people and representations. And part of the main reason for the delay is so that when you see something, you're already making judgments, as opposed to if you're just reading the text. There is that kind of advantage. And we talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these different mediums. And I think it's really important to think about that, right? Why, if I see an image of someone who doesn't look like me, I can't identify with them when it fits in a written text. I can. Or vice versa. I have a better sense of what's happening watching a film because I have a worldview as opposed to just literature. And I think it works really successfully, actually. And then when I do teach comics and comics analysis, I call attention to their own observations because we all know how to read images at this point, but it's more breaking down that process and what is the kind of produced knowledge that's readily available, but then how do you articulate it? What are the cartoonists trying to get us to understand and how, right? That's the same thing for literary analysis, film analysis, and bande dessinée is what are the tools being used to shape my understanding of this text? And then for the other one, the Francophone women cartoonist, I really liked teaching that one. And my goal, so we started reading comics from the very first day, but my goal was to kind of look at norms, mainstream norms and standards. And so I had them all read an entire Asterix or Tintin bande dessinée to start. And then they all gave presentations within the first week, essentially. First and second week, they had to present on a bande dessinée. And from that, we kind of crafted what are the norms. And then when we started comparing the women cartoonists, we started to notice certain things. So in adventure exploration type bande dessinée, where you have a male protagonist, the world is there for them, right? So the narrative focalization is all for male discovery, whereas many of the bande dessinée by female cartoonists, it's about the society, but it has to be more complex. So just visually, if you compare something like Tintin to Aya, the background is so much more rich because you can't talk about women without talking about society. And so we have some of these observations as we go along. I don't come out and say that, but we work towards that as a class. The other thing that I had them do is make their own comic from the beginning. I had lots of assignments that built up to the final comic. We had a workshop day in class, and then we also had a Comic-Con. I had them do a Comic-Con, and they had to circulate, and they had to describe what they did. And I think after the second change, all of them were overwhelmed by having to repeat themselves. And so through practice, they started to realize that comics artists, every single thing that's on the page is a decision that you have to make. The color, the image, the placement, the relationship between the page from one page to the next. And then also, how do you keep talking about the same story that you told? You have to have a good understanding of it. And so it was really nice to kind of do liberal arts and practice with that class. And I think it worked really well.
Amazing. I love it. I love your everything that you're doing with comics there with bande dessinée. Comic-Cons and fests in Africa. And this is another curious kind of big omission and like weirdness, I think, in sort of comic studies in the US and maybe the West generally, where there's this kind of like, oh, they have comic fests as well. But yeah, maybe, can you tell us about this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there are a lot of them, and they've been going on for a long time. And I tried to get funding to go to a couple of them, and the stability of some of the countries I tried to go to wasn't always conducive for me to do research. But they exist. in some of in the Francophone countries, in some ways, it does imitate what happens in Angoulême, in the same way that it's kind of this post-colonial relationship. A lot of times, some of the ones in Cameroon and Gabon and both of the Congos, for example, they're very supported by French institutions. So the Institut Français, you still have the funding coming from Europe a lot of times, or co-funded at least. But yeah, they exist. The most successful one now, I think the biggest one right now would be FIDA, the one in Algeria, has kind of taken over as the continental one that's important. That is changing, though. I did attend some of the events for the Afropolitan Comics in South Africa, which was great. Being able to do some of this online has helped. It's actually the African Comic Con right now is taking place. So there are some events that are online right now. But it's a lot of times it's where European editors can go to scout talent. That is a lot of the case. But there are many that are much smaller in scale that are taking place quite often, and they're much more local centered and workshop centered. So it's how-to. It's classes from local schools to use bande dessinée for self-expression, or for young professionals to come and network. And so it's actually changing what the industry is on the continent more recently.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of what we're doing here in the US, right? Like with my SoulCon, the Brown, Black, and Indigenous Comics Expo, the Latinx Comics Expos, the Brown and Black Comics Arts Festival, things like that, where it's less about kind of big names and more about, really kind of championing and empowering new gen creators of color, helping them network, to workshop, all that. Is that right? Am I right?
Yes, yeah, that's definitely what's more the case now, and cosplay too. So there's this huge celebration of fan culture, but done their way, right? And it's definitely much more decentralized at this point.
Where is the vitality in comics and comic studies today? And perhaps our conversation has already answered that, but yeah.
Well, yeah, so things have changed drastically. I would even say within the last 5 years. What was going to be the coda to my book is now a full chapter, and that has to do with digital comics and the internet and apps. So the new version of comics no longer relies on kind of the traditional cultural gatekeepers. There are a lot more cartoonists now who are trained as graphic designers or who develop apps, and they can crowdsource and crowdfund now. And so a lot of new texts, a lot of new comics you can read on your phone. You can pay as you go. You can donate money. Some projects like Eliane's project, La Vie de Vendute, it was just a blog to begin with, and then through crowdfunding, she was able to turn it into a series. So the models have changed, and there's been more of a dialogue between Anglophone African comics and French bande dessinée, which didn't exist prior to this. So when people say African comics, everyone thinks of Anglophone ones, but actually the Francophone ones have a longer history. But it's more recently, because of this turn towards superheroes and graphic design, there's a lot more manga, a lot more cartoonists were self-taught through the internet, and so you see much more manga being used to self-represent than before. But it is digital comics. It is more kind of this network of cartoonists who share all of their work online in process, and it's kind of the internet is your workshop and your fan base. So there's this huge community of cartoonists that share daily sketches just for feedback, or a single page, or now animation is more the vehicle to get yourself known. It's a multi-platform strategy and approach to making comics and making a career out of comics than the center periphery model from the past. But the other part of that, though, is that because there's been a new surge in this and it's changing, there's been a resurgence for cartoonists who've been around since the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s. And so cartoonists who have been producing this entire time are now having more, the ability to publish more. So someone who might have thought that their career was over now has more chances to produce. And actually, Badri Bahuti, who's the Congolese cartoonist and who's been instrumental for decades now. He's been working since the 1980s in popular bande dessinée in France, and it's only now that one of his bande dessinée is going to be translated into English and comes out next year, Madame Livingston. It's 2021, and he's been publishing since the 80s, and it's only that he's being translated into English now. And so I think that finally these things are coming into their own, and there's so much already that pre-exists, and so much to come as well.
So excited to see what's coming and go back and see what's been happening. Michelle, can you tell us what's next for you? I know you're working on your book, but yeah, what's next?
Yeah, so I'm working on finishing my book to get it out there. I think it'll be a great resource for lots of people. I know there has been a lot that's already written about Aya, but there's so much that hasn't already been said. So there's that, and I kind of want to be able to give the context to comic studies for this whole wealth of production. But beyond that, I am, as I mentioned, I'm more interested as well moving forward in the use of this multimodal form for information, for the production of knowledge. And so I just recently submitted an article on the representation of the Senegalese riflemen in bande dessinée. And so kind of revisiting some the use of comics as history. Abina and the I forget the full title, but Abina came out and people have written about that one. But in France and in Africa, how do cartoonists use bande dessinée as a form of history or as an alternative archive? You brought up the Serge Diantantu, his work, for example, on slavery as well. How are these sites of not storytelling, but history that are just as valid as a textbook, right? Or allow us to think in different ways?
Really powerful. And I imagine the multi-platform kind of as approach and materialization of the comics has really liberated that space of comics as history, I'm imagining.
Mm-hmm.
Really exciting, Michelle. Gosh, thank you for gifting me the time right now, our listeners and our viewers, but also just for all the incredible work that you're doing on, Black bande dessinée, multi-platform comics today coming out of Africa. I'm so excited for your book. I can't wait for that. Thank you, Michelle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.